Okay, step one, put the argument in standard form. This means you need to find the conclusion. What is the argument leading to? And to help you find the conclusion, it helps to look for conclusion indicators, words like therefore, accordingly, we may conclude that, and so on. Identify all the premises that support that conclusion. How do you find the premises? Well, there are premise indicator words that are often helpful. Since, as indicated by, because of, for, in that, etc. So there's all these different expressions that we use to indicate that a premise is supporting something. The next part of putting the argument in standard form is to make every statement in the reconstruction a complete declarative sentence. This is one that students often fail to do. I'm not sure why, but it's crucial. You have to do this. Make every statement in the reconstruction a complete declarative sentence, right? You can't use sentence fragments, you can't use questions, and you can't use imperatives. Why not? Because to evaluate an argument, you have to evaluate whether or not the premises are true. And sentence fragments, questions, and imperatives can't be true. So the question, did you eat any cheese? It has a true answer, which is yes or no, but the question itself is not true or false. It's a question. It's a different kind of sentence. Imperatives, eat the cheese. That's not true or false either. It's an imperative. It's doing a different kind of work. So when you're making an argument, you need to find all the premises, and you have to make them a declarative statement that can either be true or false. And then you want to omit stuff. Anything that isn't a premise and isn't a conclusion, leave it out. It's just extra stuff. What you're trying to do is boil the argument down to its essence. So just take the premises and the conclusion. So that means getting rid of any redundancy, rhetorical flourishes, and historical contextualizing. Okay, one important and rather complicated feature of step one is when you're dealing with complex arguments that have intermediate conclusions. So this happens a lot because philosophers tend to daisy chain several arguments together, and that means that the conclusion of one argument will end up functioning as a premise in another argument. So you have two arguments that are linked together by a premise that serves as a conclusion and then also as a premise. So when a statement plays this dual role, it's called an intermediate conclusion. So here's an example. Since everybody deserves life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, nobody should be denied basic nutrition, shelter, and healthcare. Consequently, the government should provide a safety net, as the private sector won't provide these basic necessities. Now, there's a couple of arguments, a couple of daisy-chained arguments happening here. And this is not a well-written piece of text, right? So part of the problem with reconstructing this is that it's written in a way that isn't very clear. It's difficult to follow how the premises are connected and so on. But that's part of the point. Khalifa used this text because he wanted to show you how complicated it can be to reconstruct an argument that has intermediate conclusions. Okay, so what's the conclusion of this argument? What does the author want you to conclude after you read it? Well, this is the conclusion. The government should provide a safety net. So that's what this little passage is, wants to justify. The government should supply a safety net, provide a safety net. What's the intermediate conclusion? So remember, an intermediate conclusion is a statement that's playing that dual role. It's the conclusion of one argument, and then it serves as a premise in the next argument. And the intermediate conclusion is here in blue. Nobody should be denied basic nutrition, shelter, and health care. That's what links the first argument to the second one. So it's a conclusion that follows from this. Since everybody deserves life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, therefore, no one should be denied basic nutrition, shelter, and healthcare, presumably because those things are part of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So that's a conclusion of that initial argument. But it's also a premise that in conjunction with this claim justifies the conclusion. So it's a conclusion of the first argument, but then it becomes a premise in another argument. Nobody should be denied basic nutrition, shelter, and healthcare. The private sector won't provide these things. Therefore, the government should provide them. So that statement in blue, nobody should be denied basic nutrition, etc., it's playing a dual role. It's the conclusion of an argument and it's a premise in an argument. So it's an intermediate conclusion. So that means that if you reconstruct the argument this way, since everybody deserves life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, nobody should be denied basic nutrition, shelter, and healthcare. The private sector won't provide these basic necessities. Therefore, the government should provide a safety net. You haven't identified all the premises and conclusions. you have to identify all the premises and all the conclusions. So that means if you have an intermediate conclusion, you have to identify it as a conclusion and as a premise. So to be complete, you should do it this way. Everybody deserves life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Therefore, nobody should be denied basic nutrition, shelter, and healthcare. That's your intermediate conclusion. The private sector won't provide these basic necessities. Therefore, the government should provide a safety net. So this is basically the end of step one. You've identified the statements that are serving as premises, you've identified the conclusion, and you've identified an intermediate conclusion, a statement that serves both as a conclusion of an argument and also as a premise in another argument. So you've put it in standard form. You've clearly identified all the premises and conclusions. So that's step one.